good afternoon, everyone, and again, welcome. My name's Jane Scott, and it's a pleasure to serve as the President and CEO of the Columbus Metropolitan Club. And I don't usually do this part, so one of my board members usually do, but I got nominated today, so thank you so much for being here. So today's program, CMC and Ohio Health present one of the forums in our ongoing series, Our Healthy Community. Today, Teen Vaping Epidemic. Please help me thank our series sponsor, Ohio Health, additional series support from Mount Carmel Health System, and the sponsor for today's forum, the Crane Group, as well as our partner, the Breathing Association. Each of our sponsors has many people represented here today. Won't you join me in thanking them? An electronic cigarette, or an e-cigarette, is a handheld device that delivers nicotine and stimulates the experience of smoking a cigarette. It works by heating a liquid, which generates an aerosol, or vapor, that is inhaled by the user. While vaping may be less harmful than smoking a cigarette for tobacco addicts, or may help those trying to quit smoking, it also can be too easy of an entry point for new nicotine users, especially teens. So let's explore these issues, and we welcome our speakers. Health Commissioner at the Columbus Public Health, Dr. Mysheika W. Roberts. Clinical Professor of Family Medicine at OSU and board member of the Breathing Association, Dr. Thomas Hudson, Associate Professor of Public Health and Law, OSU College of Public Health, and the Michael E. Moritz College of Law, Micah Berman. Clinical Professor of Family Medicine at OSU and President of Preventing Tobacco Addiction Foundation, Dr. Robert Crane. Dr. Crane, would you take the podium?
Thank you very much, Jane. First of all, I want to thank the Columbus Metropolitan Club for having us all here. It's such an honor to do this about this very important topic. A special shout out to the Breathing Association, now 112 years old, providing respiratory services across the city, doing a whole bunch of things. They put this whole thing together, and without them, we wouldn't be here. Thank you to them. Well, I want to give you a quick story about coming here. I was flying in from Utah on Monday, had to stop in Minneapolis, and I'm coming in watching on the back screen of the seat in front of me the movie First Man. And of course, this is a story of Neil Armstrong's harrowing journey for 15 years, becoming an F-15 pilot, then an astronaut. And along the way, maybe you don't know this, but 9 different pilots and astronauts died getting us to the moon. And so one of the most vertiginous aspects of this is him in the rocket, strapped in, and the rocket is shaking like crazy. I'm telling you, just vibrating the whole screen, and I'm feeling it too. And in fact, our plane is shaking like crazy as we go through this storm outside of Minneapolis. It was a visceral experience that I didn't want to repeat. The spoiler alert, of course, is that I did make it down and Neil made it to the moon. But I want you to think for 1 second, if tomorrow a 747 fully loaded came into Minneapolis wasn't so lucky. There was wind shear and ice on the wings, and they crashed, all aboard killed. That afternoon, LAX, plane taking off in the fog, hits a small plane. A Dreamliner with 450 people goes down, all killed. That afternoon, in Queens, New York, taking off from Kennedy, is a plane that runs across, of course, a flock of Canada geese. Captain Scully is not there. They all go down, another 400 killed, and 200 on the ground, hitting in Queens. In one day, 1,400 people dead. And think it happens the next day, too. And that's Saturday coming up. Well, it wouldn't happen on Saturday because no one would ever fly again. But that's tobacco. 1,400 deaths every single day in the U.S., losing 10 years off their life to an addiction that we can't seem to stop. Now, of course, that's an addiction to these things, right? We're not talking about these things today. We're talking about this thing. And the real question we ask ourselves, of course, is this a really great idea in stopping these things? Or is this the road to hell paved with good intentions and a whole boatload of money? We're going to talk a little about the epidemiology of that today and how this epidemic has started. I know that at Ohio State, at the College of Public Health, they've been doing some studies on our own freshmen at OSU. Micah, I think you know about that.
Yeah, so what we've seen just over the last year in terms of youth vaping is remarkable and truly disturbing. Actually, the vaping rate or e-cigarette use rate among kids had started to level off, and it was about 11% nationally, and in the last year it has zoomed up to almost 21%. So that is 3 million high school kids in the U.S. Having used an e-cigarette in the past month. If you add in middle school kids, that is 3.6 million. If you add in college kids, we're now talking probably 7 million or so. What we've seen at Ohio State is that same increase reflected in the freshmen coming into Ohio State. So 2 years ago, the survey that we did among freshmen showed that about 5.6% of incoming freshmen to Ohio State had used an e-cigarette in the past month. This year, 2018, freshmen coming in, it was 29%, which would be about right. If the high school rate is 21%, that rate is probably highest for seniors, and that's what we're seeing at Ohio State. So that is just a remarkable, remarkable increase. What Dr. Crane just held up there was a Juul e-cigarette, which I think anyone who has kids who are in middle school or high school is probably familiar with. That is clearly what has been driving the increase over the last year. You see the e-cigarette rate spike up, and you see the Juul rate spike up in almost perfect parallel. So that increase is almost entirely driven by Juul.
In fact, we have a little show and tell here. At each table, at least up to 11 tables, we have a set of vape devices. Some are Juuls, some are other vape devices. They're all open. I ask you to open them up, take them out. Some of them are actually live. You can take a puff if you want to. Maybe it's not hygienic or smart, but you could. There are 11. I expect to get 11 back at the end, right? I especially want you to pay attention to the Juul devices. That's what this looks like. I put it right down here. This little device right there, it comes apart. This is the pod. You'll see the pod that has a little bit of liquid in it, liquid equivalent to 1 pack of cigarettes. Well, Tom Houston, you've had 30 years of experience looking at this. Tom used to run the AMA's Smokeless States initiative. Tom was essentially in charge of almost all tobacco control in the United States at one point, sponsored by Robert Wood Johnson. He's been doing this a long time. You remember what it was like back then and what it's like now, the new tricks up their sleeve.
Yeah. And the tobacco industry has been at this for decades, since the first ads for cigarettes in 1913 for Camel. I'd walk a mile for a Camel, and now, fast forward, we are looking at this uptake of electronic cigarettes by kids. We have for you on your cell phones and smart devices a link that the Metropolitan Club has provided for you. Stanford University's research on tobacco advertising is legendary, and the link we have provided for you shows the juxtaposition of the Juul campaign starting in 2015, the vaporized campaign, which has all the hallmarks of the conventional cigarette ads in years past, associating the use of the product with fun, with glamour, with athleticism, with being a part of the crowd that kids want to join. Having electronic cigarettes be a part of daily life and making it a normal thing, and making it something that kids want to do, whether intended or not. The output of this and the ads that they've used on social media mostly have had an effect as Micah has pointed out, of a dramatic increase in the use of these products in high school and in young adulthood. So this is part of what's driving this. The other part is flavors. The industry, the tobacco industry, has used flavors for many, many years. In 2009, legislation was passed that removed flavors from cigarettes except for menthol. And now what we're seeing with the electronic cigarettes is, because they have yet to be regulated, there are thousands, perhaps over 10,000 flavor combinations for electronic cigarettes. And flavor is one of the reasons kids are attracted to this. Curiosity, wanting to be a part of the gang, part of the club that uses these products, and the flavor continues to push this. As kids start smoking, whether it's conventional cigarettes or e-cigarettes, it doesn't take very long for them to lose autonomy over nicotine. Nicotine's a very, very addictive drug. My colleague Joe DeFranza at the University of Massachusetts has looked at this extensively, and in his research, he shows that it only takes a total of about 10 or 15 cigarettes smoked for a kid, for an adolescent, to lose control, to lose autonomy over cigarettes. About half the kids who have gotten to 10 or 12, 15 cigarettes say, I don't have as much control over smoking as I want. I'm losing my autonomy. By the time they've smoked 100 cigarettes over their lifetimes, 90% of them will tell you, I don't feel like I'm in control. We don't know yet how much the equivalent of Juul or other electronic cigarettes needs to be to reach this threshold of loss of autonomy. But the uptake of nicotine through these devices is now, in the latest generation, approaching that of conventional cigarettes. And so we worry that children will have the same sort of effect as they have with smoking conventional cigarettes. They tell us that they have the same sort of withdrawal effects when they try to stop. So the parallels with nicotine dependence in conventional cigarettes and e-cigarettes are striking.
Flavors, of course, have been a problem all along. Flavors, particularly in regular cigarettes, mask some of the noxious feeling. And for some individuals, that's the only way they can really go with cigarettes. And I was going to ask Dr. Roberts to talk a little bit about one particular flavor, menthol.
Well, thank you, Dr. Crane, and thanks for having me here today. We know that menthol can be very addictive, but also very attractive to our younger population. And as you said, it can encourage and make it easier for individuals to smoke or to vape. We also know that when you are exposed to menthol, that you have some immediate health impacts as well as some long-term health impacts that we're really concerned about. Some of the immediate health impacts could be headaches, seizures, dizziness, and then obviously some of the long-term can be very similar to what we see with traditional tobacco products as well, whether it's cancer, lung disease, and things of that nature, neurologic problems. So it is concerning that many of our manufacturers here are using that as a means to get people hooked and addictive, and especially getting people at young ages hooked and addicted.
Of course, menthol has a particular affinity for African Americans. At least 75% of African Americans use mentholated cigarettes. And of course, at least half of kids who smoke cigarettes choose menthol first because of that masking flavor. Talking about flavors a little bit, the Juul, I want you to all look at this, by the way, because at least when this appears in the laundry from your kid's jeans pocket, you'll know what it looks like. Or you'll find it in the back of their underwear drawer. But if 40% of kids have it at Ohio State, you may imagine that your kids have it as well. Juul did an amazing job, a miraculous job with social media marketing. Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. For the last 2 years, Juul has dominated these venues. They hired social media influencers, that is, kids who have millions of followers, and allowed them to vape on camera. Now, Juul's trying to back off that with tremendous pressure from the FDA, but there's obviously a long way to go, and that residual addiction will be a challenge to overcome. Now, I think Dr. Berman, or Professor Berman, you have been, I'll give you a doctor if you want. You have kind of been working with the FDA in the past. You know some of their parameters and some of their strengths and weaknesses. What can the FDA do?
Well, it's an interesting day for the FDA, as probably a lot of you know that the FDA commissioner announced yesterday that he will be stepping down. So the commissioner has been Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who has been very personally involved in the issue of regulating tobacco and e-cigarettes in particular. I think he sort of came in with a predisposition to seeing e-cigarettes as a very positive development that would be able to help people quit smoking. And over the last year, he has paid attention to the data, and he has been appropriately shocked and dismayed by the rising levels of youth e-cigarette use. And so he has spoken out very aggressively about it. But we are still sort of waiting to see that the speech translate into action on a lot of different fronts. So the FDA has extremely powerful tools under the 2009 Tobacco Control Act to regulate e-cigarettes. Part of the problem here is that they didn't even apply that regulatory scheme to e-cigarettes at all until 2016, even though they could have done that starting in 2009. They didn't do it until 2016, and even though they now have the authority to regulate those products, they haven't really done it. So what is apparently in the works, and this is all from just reporting, there's no public announcement yet from the FDA, but what is apparently in the works is the FDA is proposing a rule to prohibit the sale of flavored e-cigarettes in stores that are accessible to youth under the age of 18, but a couple important caveats there. One is that the proposed rule apparently exempts menthol, so it applied to flavors other than tobacco flavors and menthol flavors. And then, of course, the other big caveat is we don't know what's going to happen with Dr. Gottlieb gone, whether this is something that the next commissioner will pick up and continue to move forward or not. And then, of course, the FDA rulemaking process, for any of you who have been involved in that, is not fast. So even if the FDA continues to move forward with this, which would be a step in the right direction, it's not going to be a quick step. There are other, it's a complex regulatory scheme that I could talk about for a very long time. There are other things the FDA could do to act much more quickly, but it seems that the road that they're taking will probably mean that they don't get ahead of this problem, and they will still be trying to catch up for quite a long time.
You may ask yourself why the FDA didn't act earlier. They have absolute authority. They could have stopped vaping. They could have stopped Juul right in the infancy. They elected not to because, of course, they believe that possibly Juul and other vape devices are the off-ramp to the use of combustible cigarettes. What they really hadn't counted on, or what they were underestimating, was the on-ramp for kids who would never have smoked a cigarette. So, Dr. Houston, I was hoping you would tell us about their ideas about this being a harm reduction strategy of getting people who are addicted to smoking, the 40-year-old who can't quit and needs something else. Does it work?
Yeah, and the literature on the use of electronic cigarettes as a means to quit smoking is decidedly mixed. There are some studies that seem to show that as people try to use conventional means to stop smoking and don't do well with those, or decide they don't want to use those for whatever reason, that there are some people who use electronic cigarettes as the alternative to nicotine replacement therapy that you can buy at the pharmacy, or the prescription medicines that doctors use to help people stop smoking. And there's some folks who have been successful at doing that. The large-scale studies, though, have not shown that it's been as effective as the conventional products. There's only one study that I've seen that was published about a month ago that showed a benefit compared to traditional products. And that was in a study in which people who were using the electronic cigarettes had counseling every week to go along with it. The benefits of harm reduction, of switching from Marlboros to vape products, only works if you completely switch. And what we see most in the United States is that adults are dual users. They use vaping devices in places and situations where they can't smoke, and they continue to use their conventional combustible cigarettes most of the time. And when that's the case, the benefits to health are really non-existent. So people have to switch completely to electronic products to get any benefit at all. There are theoretical benefits. There are fewer chemicals in the vapor than in combustible cigarette smoke. There are, of those products that we can measure, it's an order of magnitude less of those products that are there. But we do know that there are long-term health effects, potentially heart disease, lung disease, and other issues that we really haven't studied well enough yet to say, I want you to switch, and it's okay for you to be an electronic cigarette user for the next 20 years. We don't know whether we can say that or not. So over the short term, it may have some benefit to some smokers. The American College of Cardiology, for example, has recently issued a statement saying that for patients who decide they can't use the other products, don't want to use the other products, and if we can get them to switch to vaping in combination with counseling, that we should add that to our armamentarium. But it shouldn't be the preferred way to help people quit smoking, that we should look at the conventional FDA-approved methods first. And I think that's the way to go. How helpful it will be in the long run, we just don't know.
The big issue, of course, is you have to completely stop.
Yeah.
And the overwhelming majority of people who use vapes over the age of 25 or 30 are dual users. They only use the vapes when they can't smoke. And there's a reason for that we'll talk about in a minute, because Marlboro delivers a better punch than does a Juul. And therefore, people who are addicted to Marlboro have a difficult time going back the other direction. But even those who do, and there's probably a couple of 100,000 who quit each year moving only to vape devices like a Juul. The problem is the other end. If you have 7 million kids who are addicted to Juul, or at least using Juul in the last 30 days, that's a 35-to-1 ratio the wrong direction. Think about that. 35-to-1. For every one person who stops smoking using Juul, we have 35 kids who start. That's a bad ratio. The other problem, of course, is that there is a disparity in how smoking affects different populations. And Dr. Roberts, I was hoping you kind of talk to us about those disparities and the challenges we face with moms who are smoking.
Sure. So we know that smoking, as everyone knows, has an impact on your health, but it also has an impact on pregnant women and the health of their baby. So pregnant women who smoke are more likely to have a baby who is born prematurely and a baby who is born of low birth weight, which puts them at increased risk to not making it to their first birthday. We also know that young babies who are exposed to secondhand smoke are more likely to die from SIDS, or sudden unexplained death, than babies who are not exposed to secondhand smoke. Here in Franklin County, we know African American babies are more likely to die before their first birthday than Caucasian babies. And we also know that even though about 25% of adults here in Franklin County, about 26% for African American, about 24% per Caucasian, actually smoke, but the health impacts on the African American community of those smokers is much greater than it is in the Caucasian population. African Americans are more likely to die from complications and diseases that are impacted by tobacco use than Caucasians, and we see it on a daily basis on our infant mortality rates in terms of those babies dying before their first birthday because they're either exposed to secondhand smoke, their mom smoked when they were pregnant, or they're around smoke in their homes. We also know that that the manufacturers spend extra dollars and do more advertising in the African American community, thus enticing that community to smoke and get involved in smoking.
And just a reminder that for grown-ups who are 40s and 50s, it is those combustible products that probably get them, that help cause the cancer, the lung disease, the heart disease. And of course, that goes away when you use a Juul. But for kids and for pregnant women, the issue is nicotine. Nicotine is almost certainly what causes problems in utero, and nicotine is almost surely what causes the problems with kids. I want to talk a little bit about what we have started to do here in Columbus. And it's an exciting adventure that's kind of now spread across the country in 20 Ohio cities and 440 cities across the country. We've raised the age to buy any nicotine or tobacco product to 21, trying to cut off that access a little bit, along with reducing their desire to do this, is probably our only way to change this epidemic. Columbus is one of the leaders in doing this. Dr. Roberts, leading the Columbus Health Department, has been instrumental in making this happen. Would you tell us a little bit about how you have kind of helped enforce this issue, which retailers kind of resist a bit?
Yeah, sure. So I would have to give credit where credit's due, and this was done with the help of our city council and my predecessor, Dr. Teresa Long, who's here in the audience. But this has been a work in progress. City council passed a law in the end of 2016, and we started doing a lot of education and enforcement of retail establishments in 2017 to get the word out that we here in the city of Columbus would start licensing establishments that wanted to sell tobacco and tobacco products and any paraphernalia. There's a $150 fee for them to get the license from the city, and then we start doing enforcement. And the enforcement is much easier said than done. We actually have to hire individuals who are under the age of 21. We accompany them with one of our staff members who is obviously over the age of 21, and they go out into these establishments and they do buys. They attempt to buy tobacco products, and if they do sell to an underage minor, and they do, unfortunately, we fine them. And the first fine is $500, and the second fine is $1,000. So it has taken time to get the establishments, the retail establishments, to understand that we are serious about this. But by delaying the access to tobacco products and not selling to individuals who are under the age of 21, we have an impact of reducing those who smoke by like 90%. So that's a huge impact. So we're proud that we're doing it here. We're also now doing it in Worthington, and there are some other communities here in Franklin County that are doing it with the assistance of Franklin County Public Health. And as Dr. Crane mentioned, it's spreading all over the state and all over the country. And so we're proud to be doing that. We will continue that work. We will continue to educate the public and the retail establishments, and we will continue to enforce them.
Great. And I want to say that here in Columbus, because of what you and Columbus Public Health have done, it's been a transformation in the retailers. They've understood what has to be done. They're paying attention now. But raising the age is not enough. You can't just cross out 18 and put 21. There has to be a level of enforcement, awareness, education, a whole program that goes along with this. Unfortunately, after fighting Tobacco 21 for the last 6 or 8 years, Altria, and now their partner Juul, have decided to turn around. And all of a sudden, you know, they're in favor of Tobacco 21. In fact, they pushed the bill through Virginia in about 3 weeks. And what they do, they raise their age up, cross out 18, put 21, and who gets punished if someone buys a pack of cigarettes? The kid and the $750 an hour clerk. Is the retailer ever at risk in Virginia? No. If a 21-year-old or 20-year-old is walking down the street carrying a pack of cigarettes, can they be arrested in Virginia? Absolutely. Not here in Columbus. We did it the right way. We put the focus on the folks who are making a profit. And we changed their behavior because of what you've done. And it makes a huge difference if we do it right. In the legislature in Columbus, here they're already working on a bad bill sponsored by Altria. We'll try to have against it a good bill. We'll see how this all works out, good versus evil. Anyway, I want to come back a little bit to the sense of why addiction is so important. Understanding addiction is kind of like understanding memory. If you look around this room, the things that you see that come into your senses, almost all that memory you have on the short term is a chemical issue, right? It's synapses sending neurotransmitters back and forth. But 2 weeks from now, what you may or may not remember from this talk is entirely architectural change, a physical change in those synapses that grew together. So each neuron has 1,000 different interactions with another neuron. Each neuron's 1,000 different connections. Those occur at the top part of your brain and the deep part. This works at the deep part of the brain. This stimulates acetylcholine, which turns on the neurotransmitter of all neurotransmitters, dopamine. So what's dopamine do for you? Well, sunlight, you feel good, that's dopamine. When your lover touches you on the cheek and you get the rush, that's dopamine. When you have a bite of a crispy apple, that's dopamine. When you feel really nice and focused, that's dopamine. Well, this gives you that too. One hit off of this, you get a spike of nicotine, spike of dopamine, focused, calm, less hungry, less tired. Great stuff, right? Now, a pack-a-day smoker, that's 20 cigarettes per day, 10 hits per cigarette. That's over 70,000 hits per year. And that changes the architecture of the deep brain. That's the part of the brain we still share with T-Rex, the reptilian part of the brain, where lust and anger and hope and fear all live. And if you hammer that part of the brain over and over and over again, what happens is a short circuit. And that short circuit is addiction. So instead of things processing well up through the top part of your brain, it's all happening down here. And what happens to nicotine and dopamine? Well, the brain doesn't like imbalance. And so it begins to dial down the response of sunshine, the response against friendship or sex or food. So the only thing that really works is nicotine. Now, if you can't smoke inside, you have to go for a ways without it. This only lasts a few minutes. And so most nicotine addicts are in withdrawal most of the time. We know that it's bad for kids because it changes their behavior. Kids who use nicotine are much more likely to use other drugs. And they're much more likely and much more susceptible to become mentally ill with schizophrenia, with bipolar disease, with ADHD. We used to think this was all a function of them self-medicating to get more dopamine in their system. We now know it changes their affect, changes their ability to handle things because of that lower short circuit. So what to do? We can encourage the FDA to take a stand. I don't think anybody thinks they will. And the fact that the stock market took a huge dip upward in tobacco stocks when Dr. Gottlieb decided to resign tells us they won't. But we can do things here. And the things that we can do, of course, are raise the age. And then as Dr. Houston talked about, the critical issue is flavors. Now, right now, Juul, under pressure from the FDA, has reduced activity and access to flavors down to menthol and tobacco flavor. And understand they add tobacco flavor to this. I want you to think about this. We have 7 million kids addicted to Juul, and now we only let them have menthol and tobacco flavors. What's going to happen? We're going to find out pretty soon. I think we've come to the end of our timing. You're pointing to me somewhere over there. Yes, that means questions? I'm getting the signal slowly here. Yes. It is CMC's tradition to take audience questions. Please state your name, ask your questions. Please avoid editorial comment. And remember, questions with a question mark. But let's get started. Anybody have a question? There's one. Jeff? Oh, there.
Yes, I'm Warren Fishman, and this is a really great forum. I was sitting here thinking that if Juul's premise is that it's designed to make people stop smoking, it could be the form of medication then. Why couldn't we require a prescription from a doctor to smoke Juul? Okay, if it's serving that purpose, it's certainly more dangerous than several drugs I take that require a prescription.
That is an excellent question. It requires sort of going back through the regulatory history a little bit to explain why we're in that situation. So what happened is in 2009, 2010, these products started appearing on the market. The e-cigarette products, sort of early e-cigarette products, started appearing, and the FDA looked at what these companies were doing, looked at what they were saying, and said, this looks like something that is intended to help people quit smoking, and if that's the case, then it's a drug, and it needs drug approval and authorization from the FDA before it can be sold. So the FDA actually seized e-cigarettes that were coming in at the border and said, you haven't actually gone through the drug approval process, and you can't sell these products. And those companies that were involved sued the FDA, and while that lawsuit was in progress, Congress passed the Tobacco Control Act, giving the FDA the authority to regulate tobacco products, and those e-cigarette companies sort of jumped on that as quickly as they could and said, actually, we are also tobacco products, and therefore, if you want to regulate us, you have to regulate us as tobacco products and not as drug or drug delivery systems. And the Court of Appeals agreed with them in 2010, so I have issues with that decision, but that's what the court said. The FDA, after that court decision in 2011, said, okay, well, if that's the situation, then we will regulate them as tobacco products. We will pass a rule that says that e-cigarettes are under our jurisdiction. That was in 2011. It actually took them until 2016 to issue that rule, which shows you the kind of pace at which things tend to work at the FDA. And so the answer to the question is because the court said so in this particular case, but it does set up a situation that really doesn't make much sense when these products that are being introduced without really any supervision at all compared to nicotine replacement products and other smoking cessation products that do go through the formal FDA review process.
You bet. Jeff Stevens, what do you got?
A lot of work to do. I am Jeff Stevens with the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network. We're the ones that take all this evidence-based stuff and try and translate it into public policy that affects big impact on population health. I want to thank, in particular, this gang up here who I work with at the hip to work with our lawmakers to make the changes. So thank you. The last two General Assemblies, we've run into this obstacle about these e-cigarette products are a pathway to cessation, and we hear the anecdotal stories, and it's sort of been pushed down the road. The evidence has been sort of inconclusive to their impact on cessation. The nugget you just gave me, Dr. Crane, was powerful. 35, basically, there are 35 kids on the on-ramp for every one adult on the off-ramp. So thank you for that. But I'd like to ask you a little bit more about something you alluded to right at the end, and this is maybe for you and Micah. That on-ramp is just for e-cigarettes. How much do we know about how those kids are moving from the e-cigarettes into the combustibles? We know that, I mean, I've heard some numbers floated around, but you know, we'd sure like to have a little, what's the latest data that, you know, how many kids that pick up an e-cigarette are going to turn to the combustible nicotine delivery device, the cigarette?
Really important question, Jeff. So we know that kids who are exposed to e-cigarettes, depending on which study you look at, have between 4 times and 8 times the chance of picking up a combustible cigarette compared to a kid who's never smoked an e-cigarette. What we don't know yet is what percentage of kids will go on from e-cigarettes to combustibles. But I got to tell you, if this is any indication of what happened with filtered cigarettes or low-tar cigarettes or the other innovations that came from the industry, the odds are that they're coming back to Marlboros. And there's a reason for that, because Marlboros deliver a better punch. The vape devices heat the e-liquid, they boil it, at about with 300 degrees centigrade. Burning, 900 degrees. So the particle that comes off of this is larger than the particle that comes off of that. The particle that comes off of this hits in the upper airways, the bronchioles, the bronchi, and is absorbed through the venous system and is slower. This engineered perfectly by Philip Morris. The right pH, the right size particle goes down to the alveoli of the lungs. It goes the pathway of oxygen straight from the lungs to the left ventricle and boom to the brain, 6 seconds. A much faster action than this. If you will allow the analogy, this is oxycodone. This is heroin. We don't know which way they're going to go, how often they'll go from this to this, but if any history tells us anything, it's a bad idea.
I'm Rob Brubaker. I'm on the board of the Breathing Association. I want to add my commending and thanking this outstanding panel. I'd like to hear what you can tell us about the cost of vaping devices, and I have two questions related to the cost of vaping devices. One is, what's the tax on vaping devices? And whatever your answer is, I'm sure it's not near enough. And the second is, how do the cost of vaping devices compare to the cost of a nicotine patch or the conventional drug therapies for tobacco cessation?
I can certainly answer the first part. The tax is zero. So it varies state by state. There are some states that now have state-level taxes on e-cigarettes, but Ohio is not one of them. So there is no tax other than the general sales tax. We know from decades and decades and decades of research on tobacco products that the most effective tool for keeping kids from smoking is increasing the price. So increasing the tax would be sort of the obvious first step to reduce youth e-cigarette use. So I hope that the governor is going to announce his budget next week, and I certainly hope that that is something that is on the table, but we'll see. Do you want to talk more about
And you can thank Mr. Stevens and the Cancer Society for pushing that tax, because it's crazy to be zero. Yeah. Judge Brown.
Good afternoon. My name's Eric Brown. I currently serve as a member of the Columbus Board of Education, but past life spent 6 years in the tobacco wars. 20 years ago, I learned a great deal, and all of this continues to sound familiar. The one thing I take some exception to, Dr. Crane, is way at the beginning, you mentioned that the development of these products, the vaping products, that tobacco companies were acting in good faith. I'm not entirely sure that that's true. I doubt that. These are profit centers for the tobacco industry, lifelong tobacco centers, maybe a shortened life, but they knew what they were doing. My question is about public resources, to focus on this. These days, the hottest topic for politicians and for public resources has been the opioid addiction. And it's sexy, it's less understood by people. It's an immediate death when somebody overdoses and uses fentanyl at the same time. This, I am virtually certain, affects far more people's lives, results in earlier deaths for all of the users. How do we get public dollars that are needed to help fight this directed at vaping, or juuling, as my grandsons tell me, versus, and I don't want to diminish the need for effort on opioid use, but how do we get the attention that's needed to be able to apply public resources to this fight?
Well, I think you're facing one of them right now. It's just this chance to educate. I think that's a perfect question. And it's not a zero-sum game. Money we use on opioids doesn't go away to take money to take care of this epidemic. We do know that almost everybody who uses opioids starts with cigarettes. Almost every alcoholic uses cigarettes. 95% of people with schizophrenia use cigarettes, and they use cigarettes first. It's a bigger epidemic than just the death epidemic, but it's also part and parcel of the whole addiction issue that we have to address as a whole.
Yeah, and let me throw in two more things for that. And I'm happy that somebody with a history in education has come up with a great question, because education's a big part of this. Kids who use electronic cigarette products have the belief that these products, number one, are not addicted, that many times they say, I'm not using a vapor or a device that has any nicotine at all. Remember, as Micah said, these are largely unregulated, and when you test the liquid in the vaping stores, even the ones that say zero nicotine often have quite a bit. So the kids are getting nicotine whether they know it or not. They are woefully uneducated about the issue of dependence and don't think, even if they believe they're getting nicotine, they believe, most of them, it'll be easy to stop. It'll be easy to quit. So education is a big part of all this. And the other piece of it is, as Dr. Crane alluded, how this becomes ubiquitous in society and how it becomes normal. And so what we worry about is that as Altria has a 35% share in Juul now, most of the big international tobacco companies either own or have a large stake in e-cigarette companies, that they will use this to perpetuate the normalcy, the ubiquity of smoking and of tobacco use, of nicotine use in society. Even as cigarette use is going down, they will have a toehold to get back into society with the normalization of smoking through e-cigarettes. So it's a complicated problem, and one that the conventional tobacco industry is taking advantage of. But education's a big deal, and we need to do a lot more of it with our children.
There's time for one more question. Is that right? One quick question.
Hi, my name's Adam White with the Center for Community Solutions. And speaking of public dollars on this issue, my interest is in tobacco's impact as a driver of costs in healthcare, and particularly as a driver of spending in Medicaid. We know that about a third of Medicaid enrollees are also tobacco users. So my question is, are you all aware of any studies or evidence of vaping across income levels? Is it more of a fad among middle class suburban kids, or does it stratify all income levels? And is there in turn a concern of vaping driving up the associated costs of smoking in Ohio's Medicaid program?
I'm going to answer this very quickly. We know that vaping is mostly white suburban kids so far. Juuls are white suburban kids so far. But it's always been true all along that African-American kids, Hispanic kids, start smoking later in their adolescence. They catch up, unfortunately, quite nicely. But it may be the simple function of that this iPhone of vape devices has caught on with that early population. We'll see what happens as it moves forward. Now, I have one last thing, and that is a metaphorical magic trick. Ari here has elected to volunteered to become my assistant. Here's the metaphor. I want you, you're right there, Ari, if you wouldn't mind. I want you to think of this milk as being the kind of innocence of our kids' brains. This is what we'd like them to kind of grow up to be, pure and good and wholesome. But we have to do policy things to make that work. So, come back this way a little bit, Ari. This is just a record. Good. So, we're going to construct for Ari a little protection device, right? And that protection device can be flimsy, or it can be something that really works. So, Ari, I'm going to ask you to hold this up right like that. Now, Ari, you're not allergic to milk?
No.
Okay.
Lactose intolerant, but, I think I'll do okay.
If we got milk on you, could change into something else,
Yes.
maybe? Okay.
I think it'll be okay.
All right. So I want you to hold this steady for me and don't move.
Okay.
All right. Careful, Aaron. Not too much there. Okay. I don't know, a little more. Okay, you got it?
Yeah.
Don't move. Okay, I think probably that is more than we should be doing. Okay, I'm gonna take that from you right there.
Okay.
Stand right there. Don't go anywhere.
Yep.
So, we can do it the right way and protect kids, hold the milk as it were, or we can just blow it and let it all through. We've got to make a decision ourselves. Thank you. Ari, thank you. Jane?
So I hope you found this forum interesting, informative, maybe a bit frightening, and certainly magical. And I would encourage you, you may not think about this, but this is the kind of forum that you might want to share with your family, your kids, your grandkids, a church class that you teach or something. I know it's tough to get through to kids, but at least you've got another tool that you could use. So before we leave, let's thank our sponsors, Ohio Health, Mount Carmel Health System, the Crane Group, and the Breathing Association, our partners. And certainly, let's thank our speakers, Dr. Mysheika Roberts, Micah Berman, Dr. Thomas Houston, I'll get it right this time, and Dr. Robert Crane. Thank you all, and thank you all for being here. We look forward to seeing you at the Metropolitan Club next week.